Thank you again, everyone, for your virtual attendance. In this presentation, we're going to explore using agroforestry for water management, that is, using trees and shrubs on your farm to increase the natural capacity to trap and retain water. I'm going to start with a brief introduction to agroforestry and then go through some of the mechanisms of how trees and shrubs enhance farm water availability and provide you with some examples of shelter belts, silvopasture, and riparian buffers that you can implement on your farm for water conservation. Agroforestry, more so than most disciplines, suffers from an abundance of technical jargon. So what I've been trying to do in the last few years is demystify agroforestry by placing less emphasis on the terminology and more where it should be, on the intentions and desired outcomes from using trees and shrubs. So agroforestry at its heart is the intentional planting or retention of trees and shrubs to derive any one of multiple benefits. It might be in the form of diversification, conservation benefits, enhancing productivity, aesthetics, or other values, or a little bit of each of those. Looking at it from an intents-driven standpoint, if we're using agroforestry for cultivated fields, we would be planting trees or shrubs around the perimeter of those field edges, and that might be in the form of a shelter belt, a timber belt, hedgerow, windbreak, or living fence. Trees or shrubs planted in around the corridors of water, be they streams or water bodies, have primarily a conservation focus, but they can also be used as a means of diversification or enhancing productivity, and these come in the form of integrated riparian management, riparian buffers, or sometimes referred to as green zones. And agroforestry for pasture management, for conservation or enhancing production. This is the intentional blending of trees or shrubs with forage crops and livestock production. This is referred to as silvopasture, or in BC probably more commonly as forest grazing. So in using agroforestry for water management, what we're trying to do is leverage the natural capacity of trees and shrubs to slow water cycling through the land. So by slowing it, we are able to make use of that water beneficially without having it move off too quickly. And we can enhance those farm water supplies at a lower cost than most engineered solutions, so going the route of drilling wells, building dams, impounding water, and pumping it and the like. And you also get many co-benefits from agroforestry, including reducing the potential for soil erosion, supporting biodiversity, improving water quality, and sequestering carbon. So water capture at the farm level, really, that soil water that's available in the crop root zone or surface water stored for stock watering or other uses, is the difference between your inputs, your precipitation, and those inflows, be at the surface or subsurface, and what drains away or flows away, or lost through evaporation or transpiration. And agroforestry, that placement of trees and shrubs on your farm, acts on many ways to enhance that balance of the water in your favor. It does so by enhancing the capture of precipitation, by intercepting runoff and increasing infiltration and diffusion of that water into the upper soil levels, by pulling water from lower soil profile into the upper soil profile by the process called hydraulic lift, by reducing evaporative losses from the soil surface back into the atmosphere, and by lowering overall water demand through the positive use of shade. So shade reduces heat stress, and that reduces water use by crops, by livestock, and other farm uses. I'd like to start now by just giving some specific examples of how each of these phenomena can be affected by various agroforestry applications. So in terms of enhancing precipitation capture, and in this specific example snow capture, shelter belts placed 20 meters leeward of a dugout create snow drifts that can replenish stock water. So the windward side is the area where the wind affronting the tree or shrub is coming, and then the leeward side is the protection zone on the other side of the tree or shelter belt. So that zone within 20 meters, the wind speeds drop significantly enough that they don't have the energy to carry snow along anymore, and so it creates a snowdrift. In the spring, when that snowdrift melts, that water fills a stock pond. This is important because 40% or more of your annual precipitation can come in the form of snow, so it's an important natural resource for you to take advantage of trapping. If you use evenly spaced shrubs about 6 feet apart, you can distribute snow out onto a field. It would fan out that snow load in a narrower pattern onto the field. And you use taller or denser tree or shrub clusters, such as in the graphic I just showed you, to fill a dugout. But you also have to be mindful of not capturing snow where you don't want it. So I had an example in the region of someone again who had planted trees and shrubs on the windward side of a sewage lagoon. And this was in an attempt to shade the lagoon so that the bacteria in the lagoon would work properly in their digestive processes of the sewage sludge. But the unintended consequence of that was that it was capturing a lot of snow, and when that snow melted, it caused the lagoon to overflow. So take-home lesson from that is that you always have to be mindful of your design in agroforestry so that you're maximizing the positive and minimizing the negative. At a watershed level, so again, not something that's going to happen necessarily at the farm level, you can use trees and shrubs to enhance rain capture. And this is a natural process whereby when the Earth's surface heats, warm air will rise into the atmosphere. Now, when you have a large column of warm air, that displaces colder, more moisture-laden air to the sides. So at a watershed level, when you've got localized heating, you can push your rainfall out of the valley, out of the watershed completely. You get less local rainfall. What happens when you retain trees and shrubs? It cools the surface, it dampens that convection effect, and you get more localized rain. But again, not something, unless you have a very large ranch that you're going to be able to affect on your own. You need a lot of farms at a watershed retaining trees and shrubs to get that beneficial effects of increased rainfall from trees and shrubs. Trees and shrubs have a very strong impact on infiltration rates. So they intercept runoff and then help that runoff settle into the ground. Infiltration being the fraction of surface water that soaks into that upper soil level. And trees and shrubs provide a physical barrier to water movement. So as water is moving across the soil surface, hits a solid object, slows or stops it, and then it starts to move downward into the soil profile. Trees and shrubs have very large root networks, and those act to decompact the soil and create pathways, again enhancing that water movement into the soil. And they also add a lot of living and decomposing organic matter. So trees have a lot of fine root hairs in addition to those big large coarse roots, and they turn those over every year, adding a lot of organics into the soil. And as I'll go into more details in my next presentation, organic matter has a very strong influence on infiltration rates and also water retention in the upper soil profile. And a really great example of this in action is in the use of riparian buffers to improve the infiltration rate. So healthy riparian zones can trap 2 or even 4 times the amount of soil moisture that areas without riparian buffers or unhealthy riparian buffers can. And so that water that's trapped and held is released slowly over a longer period of time to the benefit of crop production or stock water. So what this graph is showing from the USDA is that without buffers, with a very large precipitation event, you tend to get a very large quick runoff followed by lower water availability. With riparian buffers, that initial runoff is dampened because it's filling up the soil reserves below ground, and then it's slowly released over a longer period of time. So same amount of input from precipitation in both those lines, but the peak runoff is greatly reduced and extended with buffers than without. Also important to note that your buffers have to be appropriate to the width of the floodplain. So with smaller streams and creek systems, you need to have the buffer covering the area where the seasonal inundation limits are. That's the riparian zone. With a very large river system, a small narrow buffer is not going to do much in terms of trapping and holding the water. So on the Chaco River, you're going to need buffers of hundreds of meters, not tens of meters. And as previously mentioned, there are many co-benefits from riparian areas in addition to conserving water, and these come in the form of biodiversity, reducing the potential for soil erosion, and improving water quality. So again, here's a regional example. During drought, surface pond used for stock watering. As the water level recedes, the animals have to traverse across the bed of the pond to get to free water, and that creates a water quality issue. And the research has shown a very strong linkage between access to clean water and the amount of feed that is taken in by livestock, and that better feed intake translates to better weight gain. So water quality connection to productivity is there, as well as the impact that water quality would have on other users of that water in the system. Hydraulic lift. So trees and shrubs, being deep-rooted, can actually pull water that is drained into lower soil profiles back up into the surface soil layers. It does that from the process of transpiration. So transpiration is the phenomenon where water moves up from the roots through the stem and to the leaves, and then out through tiny openings in the leaves called stomates. And it does that when plants open up those stomates to exchange gases, so they let oxygen out and bring CO2 in for photosynthesis. The air being much drier outside of the leaf than inside the leaf, it pulls water through, but that creates a vacuum right through the whole system, from the canopy down through the stem and into the roots, and then eventually that creates a vacuum around the perimeter of the roots, which can pull deep water up. When it pulls that deep water up into the surface soil level, some of that can be partitioned off so that your crops benefit from that extra water in their root zone. Of course, this lift is only a net positive if the tree and shrub roots are not highly concentrated in that upper soil profile, which I'll define as sort of the top foot, that top 30 centimeters. To get around that, you have to either use widely spaced tree rows or the concept of hydrozoning. Hydrozoning is separating out species based on their root architecture so that you don't have overlap between the tree and shrub roots and where the highest concentration of your crop roots are going to be. So some regional trees and shrubs are always going to have a very low profile root. So that means most of their roots are going to be concentrated in that upper foot. That would include things like aspen, Douglas maple, poplar, red osier dogwood, spruce, willows, and also some crops tend to feed from lower profiles more than shallow profiles. This would include alfalfa, beans, parsnips, many perennial grasses, squashes, and tomatoes. So using a hydrozoning concept is just a matter of being selective about how you combine your agricultural crops with your tree and shrub placement.